Θα παρακαλέσω να πάρουμε τις θέσεις μας για να ξεκινήσουμε το δεύτερο μέρος, όπου έχουμε μία πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα συνομιλία μεταξύ του κυρίου Bruce Stokes από το German Marshall Fund και του κυρίου Αλέξανδρου Κωστόπουλου, Γενικού Γραμματέα του Αμερικανικού Εμπορικού Επιμελητηρίου. Κύριε Κωστόπουλο, αν θέλετε να πάρετε τη θέση σας, νομίζω ο κύριος Stokes θα συνδεθεί διαδικτυακά. Ευχαριστώ.
Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Εν αναμονή λοιπόν του κύριου Stokes, να σας πω ότι θα έχουμε μια εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρουσα συζήτηση για κάτι το οποίο το συζητάμε το τελευταίο καιρό πολύ συχνά, όλο και περισσότερο, αναφορικά με αυτό που λέμε τις διεθνείς επιπτώσεις ή, για να μην ακουστεί ως αρνητική λέξη επιπτώσεις, το aftermath των αμερικανικών εκλογών στη διεθνή κοινότητα, με προφανώς έμφαση στη δικιά μας γειτονιά που μας ενδιαφέρει περισσότερο, της Ευρώπης, της Νοτιοανατολικής Ευρώπης, της Ανατολικής Μεσογείου, όλα όσα είναι γύρω από την πατρίδα μας, που πάντα είναι γεμάτα προκλήσεις, κρίσεις, αλλά και ευκαιρίες. Μπορώ να σας κουράζω όση ώρα θέλετε, αλλά νομίζω ότι πρέπει να δούμε αν θα μπει ο συνομιλητής μας. Και νομίζω ότι τον έχουμε κοντά μας. Mr. Stokes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to share some time with you.
It's a great pleasure and a true privilege. I had a unique opportunity to go over the presentation that you will share with us, and I think our friends here will be extremely interested to the things that you will be sharing with us today. I think it's better if we start with your presentation, and then perhaps we can have a discussion about it.
That sounds perfect. And
So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to your questions and comments because frankly, that's how I learn more about what we're talking about, which is basically the impact of the election of Donald Trump to become president and what his administration may forebode for the world, for U.S. connection to the world, for Europe in particular. And what I want to share with you, if I can, is polling data we have for American public opinion before the election. There has not really been much polling after the election, and certainly there's not been a lot of polling on policy issues after the election. But we should keep in mind that these were the views of the American public before the election. They may change a little bit after the election, but I think the direction of American political support on a variety of international issues can be found in this data that I'm going to share with you. And it is, I think, one caution I always make when I talk about public opinion data is you may see in that data things that you think are contradictions. And I think what we have to acknowledge is that human beings are infinitely capable of holding mutually contradictory emotions at the same time. So if you see a contradiction, don't dismiss the data, just understand how complicated some of these issues are for both the public and, of course, then for the policymakers. So with that introduction, what I'd like to do is share this data with you. And the first slide, it will show the what Americans feel about international cooperation. 4 in 10 Trump voters support compromise with allies. That's only 4 in 10. There is less support among Trump supporters before the election for actually working with the allies. But 2/3 of Americans think the U.S. should not go it alone in dealing with Europe. This is one of those contradictions I mentioned. People are wary of compromise and working with allies, at least Republicans were. But on the other hand, when you actually specifically mention a region of the world, the public is more supportive. Although I would point out to you in this data that the least support in terms of age groups for compromise with Europe are younger Americans, which I find concerning as we go forward. Um, the next slide uh, shows us that three times as many Republicans as Democrats back decreasing or ending U.S. NATO commitments. There are it's still a minority of Republicans who support that, but it's a much stronger belief among American Republicans, which will certainly reinforce Donald Trump's sentiment that basically our cooperation with NATO may well be limited going forward. We don't know what nature that may take, but it's certainly something to pay close attention to. Um, with regard to Ukraine, which is certainly one of the first and foremost issues that will face the Trump administration, by 2 to 1, American voters, this is all American, Republicans and Democrats, believe that the U.S. should push for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. Now, I would caution you. Um, an average voter probably doesn't know what a negotiated settlement means, but it sounds good, and it sounds like it could end the war. But since that does seem to be where we're headed, both in terms of American public opinion and European public opinion, the support is there for the Trump administration to push for a negotiated settlement. Uh, One of the reasons I think it's inevitable we get an American push for a negotiated settlement is that uh, the aid bill that took 6 months for the Congress this year to pass for Ukraine, that aid will eventually run out, and we'll need a new aid bill through the U.S. Congress. And 4 in 10 Republicans said before the election that the U.S. was already giving too much. Republican members of Congress, and remember that Republicans now control both houses of Congress, uh, have to listen to their own voters. And their own voters, it seems to me, are telling them we've had enough of this. It's a taxpayer driven, I think, sentiment. People want to spend money at home, not abroad. But this is one of the consequences for Ukraine, and will be a major challenge going forward. The next slide, please. Uh, Turning to a different area of the world where there is a challenge for the Trump administration, 4 in 10 Americans worry that the U.S. will be drawn into a war in the Middle East. Now, there is, God willing, some hope here. It would appear that a ceasefire has been established on the Lebanon border. We still don't have a resolution of the Gaza situation. But basically, Americans don't want to be drawn into a deeper war in the Middle East. I think this will encourage the Trump administration to try to end the shooting in Gaza and along the Lebanese border. Part of the dynamic going on in the American public opinion about the Middle East is that in the last few months, there's been a rebound in America's support for Israel. It's not quite, it's hard to explain why that is. I think it's in part that the destruction of Gaza is less a dominating issue in the news, in part pushed aside by the election campaign, in part There's been slightly less of it. And it also may be that we know in public opinion that voters want to be associated with a winner. And as Israel looks like it's prevailing in its conflicts in the Middle East, Americans seem to be rallying a bit to the Israeli side. Um, and what you'll see in the next slide is that there is less worry about um, uh, the Israeli military action in Gaza. There was, and again, I think this reflects the fact that there are fewer pictures in the American press of the destruction of Gaza, and that has reduced American concern about the Israelis' military action in the region. China, a very important issue going forward for the Trump administration. One of the striking things about American public opinion about China is it has never been worse. Not even after Tiananmen Square was American disapproval of China so strong. It basically means that an American politician can say almost anything they want to about China, and the American public will support them. Um, the collapse in favorable views has happened. It's a bipartisan collapse, but as you can see, it's been much steeper collapse among Republican voters. So again, the Trump administration has the wind at its back if it goes after China. About but only a third of Americans support a 20% tariff on all countries. Um, uh, so this threat by candidate Trump to impose a 20% tariff is on all countries does not have um, broad American support. But if you ask the question differently and you ask about specific countries, what is striking is that 4 in 10 would oppose uh, duties on Mexico, which is something Donald Trump just this week has threatened. 2/3 of Trump voters would support tariffs on China. I would point out to you that there is 1 in 6, 1 in 5 support for imposing tariffs on Germany and France among Trump voters. Um, Not that he has specifically threatened that, but it certainly is not beyond the realm of possibility if there are difficulties between us and the Europeans. This, to my mind, is one of the more striking public opinion findings about a policy issue. Concern about about climate change, and support for the government doing something about climate change has decreased among all age groups. We can't really explain this. One would have expected it to remain high, especially among young people. It hasn't. Um, I think this may be just a crowding out issue where there's a series of other issues that people are concerned about. But I think this is, again, this will enable the Trump administration to do nothing about climate change or very little, and maybe even do retrograde things about climate change, because the public support, concern about, and support for doing something about it has certainly decreased. Um, uh, it is interesting, and this will be my last slide. One of the issues that doesn't directly affect Europe, but I think bears watching because of the damage it could do to American soft power and the image of America in the world, is an overwhelming majority of Republicans and a quarter of Democrats are supportive of the mass deportation of 11 million people who are in the country without documentation. Um, you have threats by the incoming head of the Immigration Service to do just this. You've had Trump multiple times say he was going to do this on the campaign trail. Logistically, it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, very expensive. But the kind of police state you would have to create to deport 11 million people is something that I think would do grave damage to America's soft power image in the world. and it certainly bears watching. So with that, I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much. Um, I I have a zillion questions, but I would start from your last slide. You would expect to. I would start from the last slide. You said, and obviously most of us agree with you, that it will be a tremendous hit on this what we perceive as soft power of the United States internationally. Do you think that the United States is clear the economic cost that it will have out of that policy of the 11 million deportations and the impact
I
in
think
the
with
international economic relations?
right. I think that I used to be a journalist, and so I'm sometimes very critical of my fellow journalists. And what was fascinating is, I swear to you, there was more coverage after the election of the economic impact of this than there was before the election. And clearly, the impact would be great. About half or more of the fruits and vegetables that are picked in the United States are estimated to be picked by undocumented people. Hotel rooms are cleaned by undocumented people. The lawn care and uh, uh, gardening needs of the American people are often done by undocumented people. The economic impact would be enormous. And when you think that that might be on top of the economic impact of the various tariffs that Donald Trump has threatened to impose on imports, I think that on one hand, if one wants to be sanguine about this, is to say that the it'll never happen because the business interests in the country will push back strongly once the economic impact begins to be felt. On the other hand, I think we need to caution ourselves that that may be wishful thinking because it would appear, at least, that Trump truly believes that this is what needs to be done. And some of the people around him, Elon Musk being one of them, has publicly said, well, there'll be a short term cost and then a long term gain. And if Trump believes that, then the short term pushback by the business community that this is inflationary, it's causing all sorts of business problems, may not have the effect that one would expect.
Thank you. You mentioned President Trump's way of thinking. Back in his first term, there was a number of, let's say, older-fashioned political people around him, a bit more experienced than what he was, that in certain very important aspects, they helped him to sort of stay within some norms that in the international political and economic relations are more well accepted. I think I exhausted all my diplomatic skills to say that question. The question is, do you think that there is a reservoir of similar people that eventually will embrace his efforts this time? Normally, you should have given me an applaud now, but yeah.
Yeah, right. No. Look, I think my personal view is that one of the lessons that Donald Trump learned in his first term is he no longer wants to have adults around him. He wants yes men. And it would appear, given the nominations he's made, that he will have more yes men around him. People who say, yes, sir, we're going to go do whatever you suggested and not try to control him, not try to steer him in a different direction. And that's certainly what happened, certainly at the beginning of the last term in particular. And we'll see how that plays out. I suppose it's entirely possible that some of the people he has nominated will be more circumspect about doing certain things that he wants done. But I would say for the most part, the people he has nominated uh, certainly would not have been in almost any other administration. So they owe their position personally to him. They have they are not of the stature that some of his original appointees were when he first came into office in 2017. And so they had their own ability to push back against him. I'm reminded of a particular incident where one of his economic advisors actually took a recommendation off of his desk so he would not read it because the person thought it was such a bad idea. I can't imagine that happening with this team of people that he's surrounding himself with in the second term.
Okay, let me take you closer to our region now. I'm sure you understand that our concern is related to the fact that Greece sits in a unique geopolitical and geoeconomic place where we are blessed with amazing opportunities, but equally constant crises and immense challenges. With regard to the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, Turkey's questionable attitude with regard to their allies. What are your thoughts in relation to the new administration in Washington?
Well, I think the president will attempt to quickly uh, achieve some kind of peace in the Middle East. And even if part of that peace in the Middle East has been achieved by the Biden administration, Trump will claim credit for it. But I do think that um, I think he clearly wants that peace to occur. It would be a distraction for his other goals. Um, I think the peace that he would appear, based on his record, to want to achieve, is a pretty Israeli triumphant position. And I think the thing that to watch in the Middle East will be how he treats the growing settler movement and the Israeli settler movement in the West Bank, which is, continuing and becoming more aggressive, and may well be something that Trump will at least support or look the other way while it happens. His his appointed ambassador to Israel has said there is no such thing as Palestine. So that if that's reflective of what Trump is willing to do, then the settlements in the Middle East could still pose a problem for the Trump administration as well as the world. Vis-a-vis Turkey, it's hard to say. Trump likes a strongman, and one can imagine that he might respect Erdogan as a result. It was never a major issue in the first term, and so we'll just have to see what happens on Ukraine, which I think is the kind of the big issue facing the world at this point, and certainly Europe at this point. I think he will push Zelensky to negotiate a settlement. Frankly, my personal view is, having worked pretty extensively on Ukraine for the German Marshall Fund, my sense is that we were going to get a negotiated settlement no matter what in 2025, even if Biden had been reelected, because taxpayers in America and Europe are getting weary of supporting Ukraine. The Ukrainian public is very, very weary of this war. And the question would just be the nature of the negotiated settlement. I think the issue that no one is addressing, which I think we all need to get our heads around, is even if you have a negotiated settlement, there's then the question of the reconstruction of Ukraine, which will cost hundreds of billions of dollars, most of which has to come from the business community. My discussions with the business community in Europe and the United States is that none of that's going to happen unless there is some kind of support, some backstopping, some war insurance provided basically by European countries in the United States. And we're nowhere in those negotiations and trying to figure out where the money comes from and what kind of insurance we would provide to the Ukraine. One, it's not going to be able to join the European Union. It's not going to be able to link up with the West in a meaningful way. It will be vulnerable politically and militarily to Russian interference. Of course, you will not get any kind of major private sector investment in Ukraine unless there is some kind of security guarantee. And NATO membership seems to be off the table at this point. So, how we actually define some kind of security guarantee for Ukraine is also unresolved and is going to be a major challenge for the new administration, assuming they're willing to deal with that. And it's not at all clear that Trump wants to be that engaged and deal making, et cetera, because there's strong pressure, I think, from many of the people around him to shift the focus to China. And it may serve Trump's inclination to do that. But what we need is an active American role in figuring out uh, both how you negotiate a peace settlement in Ukraine, what kind of security guarantees you provide, and then my real concern is how do you rebuild the Ukrainian economy?
Given, regardless of the fact that our discussion about geopolitics is extremely interesting, we still remain a business-oriented organization. So my follow-up question has to do with, do you think that rebuilding Ukraine could be a way to sort of find the Trump administration a new paradigm for the European-US collaboration? Could it be the excuse for President Trump to start liking us again?
Well, that's an interesting question. Trump is a businessman, and there are going to be huge business opportunities in Ukraine. And whether his business associates, his supporters in the business community can get to him and say, look, there are deals to be made here. There's money to be made here. Yes, we're going to need war insurance to do that. We're going to need a security guarantee. But this is a huge business opportunity. And uh, my fear is, because he has said this in public in a more general way, that once the war is over, Ukraine's Europe's problem, and I don't want to be involved in it. So um, the challenge will be to get to him, get to the people around him, and convince them that one, it's important for the peace of the world. Two, it's important for the American business community, which I would hope that there will be American voters who will say, our taxpayer dollars went to help in this war effort. We don't want somebody else to benefit from the peace effort. Um, and then the question will be, as you suggested, is there a way to re-engage with the United States on Ukraine in the reconstruction of Ukraine? And I think my personal view is that has to start with a negotiation about some kind of pot of money that the Americans and the Europeans are willing to put together. My solution would be to seize the Russian assets and use that as the backstopping for the insurance that's going to be needed for private investors. Because as the World Bank has estimated, 2/3 of the reconstruction of Ukraine has to come from the private sector. And your members will know better than certainly I do, the difficulty they would have going into Ukraine in a major way for a prolonged period if they don't have some insurance that the Russians won't come back at some point.
Mr. Stokes, unfortunately, our time is way off. I want to thank you so much for joining us. It was truly a privilege having you. And we hope next year we will have you in person. Thank you so much.
That would be great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.